Mohammed?
Mohammed said he couldn't join because he's opening his fast, so he won't be attending the session.
Well, I hope everybody enjoyed the interviews, the mock interviews. We're a tough cookie bunch of barristers at 33, but we're here to hopefully assist and give you some pearls of wisdom, because we've all been there. Can I, shall we start? Well, actually, I'm going to ask panel 2, Alex and Liz, if there's any sort of key pointers you'd like to share with the group tonight in relation to how the interviews went.
Well, I think in general they all went very, very well. It was lovely to see the candidates and to hear from their experience and to see them have to deal with me for half an hour. So good on you for that. I mean, that should be an achievement in itself. I think just the key real point from both the interviews, all the interviews that we've done this afternoon, is to let your own personality and your own sort of way of dealing with things shine through. Yes, you're going to get feedback on ways to improve, but at the end of the day, it sounds a bit corny, but you are the product at the end of the day. Chambers is going to be investing in you, so you have to show them you, not the person you think they want to see. And this is coming from someone that only ever had one interview, but about 50 flat out rejections. It only takes one, but the point is you have to show them that you, the person that you are going to be, the advocate you're going to be, not because otherwise it will get found out eventually.
Yes, I completely agree with what Alex said. I thought that all of the candidates that we interviewed today had a really nice interview style. They really showed their personalities, which I think is very important, because ultimately you want to find a set where you're going to fit in. So if you don't, and I do think you get a vibe when you go for an interview. I think Alex and I were a bit good cop, bad cop, and he was definitely the bad cop, as I'm sure everyone would imagine. But I said earlier, actually in Mohammed's interview, that I had 7 first round interviews in my very first application round and 1 second round interview. And then in my second time of applying, I had 7 first rounds and 7 second, I think. So every time you do it, you do improve. And you learn, you develop, and you learn skills for it. But I think it's definitely important to be you, and don't listen to how you think a barrister should be, because as you've probably seen already, we're all very, very different, and that's what makes the bar wonderful.
Diana and Aisha, any sort of feedback from panel 1?
I guess I'm just gonna say that this is your moment to shine during this interview, and I'm just building upon the premise of what Elizabeth and Alex just said, that it is indeed your moment, and do not be afraid to allow to show who you are, what you're passionate for, and it may sound that it's we keep reiterating that it's about passion. But nothing in the world has ever been accomplished without passion, and it's about you identifying what's your passion and what makes you unique, because we're all unique one way or another, and it's about to be able to articulate that and to be able to communicate it. So give yourself tonight to allow all this to sink into your mind, and identify, do that internal journey, the inner journey, and identify what's that makes you unique and what's your passion.
I agree completely with what everybody else has said, and I don't want to have to sit here and say the same thing over again in a different way. So what they've said is absolutely spot on.
And it goes to this point about why we had, the icebreaker question of what is your unique selling point. You're very rarely going to be asked that question unless you're in front of me, but it helps you identify in 1 or 2 sentences what makes you unique. So it's not about the fact you're a good negotiator or you like academic points of law. It's what makes you you. And once you identify that, and remember, you're going to second round interviews, you are exactly what they want. You've gone through that first hurdle or the first round. So it's about selling you, and it's being that storyteller. which we all are. That's what barristers are. We're storytellers and failed actors. So it's a bit of a performance as well to be able to engage with your panel. So that's really important. So that's the feedback from the panels. Now it is your turn. Any of you, Sophie and Charlie, Cynthia, Chloe, please feel now free. Raise your hand if you'd like to make it easier for me to identify, and then we can get the questions. We've got 25 minutes or so to do that. Sophia, would you like to ask a question? Yes, please do. Sophie.
Sorry, I didn't. So my primary question is, obviously with second interviews, you get a slightly more of a grilling, and sort of it's knowing when to sort of hammer your point home, and if there's ever a point when you think, oh, goodness me, I wish I'd never said that, it's wrong, like I need to back down. When you kind of acknowledge that someone else has made the point and you've realised that you're wrong. I don't know, my question is mainly sort of knowing how to go about that, and if it's appropriate, and if so, when.
Who would like to volunteer to answer? Aisha or Liz? Liz.
Yeah, I'll take that. I think it's good to follow your guts on questions like that. If you're having a moment where you think, oh gosh, I really shouldn't have said that. That was really silly. Then show that you know and you can appreciate that was a silly argument to make, and then make the concession. But if you don't have that sensation and your argument feels consistent and you feel like you're articulating your points well, don't shy away from them, and don't be put off because you're facing hostility or criticism from the panel, because they are there to challenge you, and that's the idea. They're there to try and replicate a judge. So I think your gut instinct is very important. I had a time when I was interviewing where I was doing an advocacy exercise, and I said something and I realized that it was contrary to my instruction. So I backtracked and I said, actually, that was incorrect. And I thought the interview went terribly. But I think the fact that I backtracked and I rectified it and I said, actually, no, and I changed the position, got me through to the next round of the interviews. So follow your gut, because I think that's always a good guide.
And also, have a pen and paper. It allows you to marshal your thoughts. Nobody will say no to allow you to have 30 seconds to a minute to say, look, this is how I'm going to marshal my plan of my answer, especially when it's so complex, you're there looking at a proposition for a certain argument rather than, but then, take your time to think, because that's what you do in court. You don't automatically respond to the judge. My lord, I just need a moment to just check that. And also know what you've put in your application inside out. Without naming names, I asked the candidate one question. They gave an example, and I said, what's the statutory framework and guidance for that? Can't remember. Know that, because you'll have Mr. Horrible like me who'll find that Achilles heel. Me and Alex, and I'm sure several others will find that Achilles heel. I remember one interview, somebody put in their interview form, well, I did this focus group, and unfortunately I did social sciences in my undergraduate, so I know about focus groups, I know about null hypothesis. So the first question I said, well, what's your null hypothesis? Blank face. So did you actually do a focus group? Didn't go well. So, know every single part of your application form. Is there anybody else from the 33 who wants to add in relation to any of the points Liz and I have already?
I think the only thing that I would sort of add is when I've coached mooting and when I've sort of coached advocacy, if you're really butting heads with someone that's asking you questions, I like to use what I describe as the 2-1 rule. So you put your position forward once, you get rebuffed. You put it forward a second time and you get rebuffed. If the conversation is still moving forward, so you're still talking about things, then you exercise your judgment about whether you want to keep that going or not. But if the point is that it becomes clear to you that either one of you, whichever, because I'm not saying that interviewers are infallible, because they're very clearly not from my own experience. But what you might need to do is if you've tried to put your position forward a couple of times and it doesn't seem to be getting through, and you're getting tied up on the same point, then it might be a case of trying to find a tactful way of shifting the focus, trying to sort of move the topic of conversation slightly further away. So for example, if you are getting told what's the statutory framework and you go, and you go, I think it's this, and then the interviewer goes, well, actually, isn't it this? And you go, and they go, no, but what about this? You can either double down, which I don't really recommend at all. That's just not a good one. You can either do what many might call the responsible thing and go, I'm sorry, I might just not know enough about this to necessarily talk about a bit more, which can be a point in your favor. Or you say, oh, but wouldn't that also relate to this? And kind of shift to a side topic. Is again, it's about trying to use your judgment and trying to move the conversation. And I like to describe it as keep control. Try and keep control of the narrative and keep control of the conversation.
Sophie, does that answer your point? Was there a point arising?
I think it can be very subjective, but that's really useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. Any of the other candidates? Cynthia, Anjali, Chloe? Questions?
Yes.
Chloe.
Oh, sorry, Anjali. Do you want to?
Sorry. Yeah, Anjali and then Chloe. Okay.
Hi, everyone. My question is, when you're given an advocacy exercise, how would you say is best to approach it? And also, do you think that it's okay, if maybe you don't know all of the surrounding case law and the relevant statute, what are they really looking for that you need to demonstrate when you're doing the advocacy exercises?
Asha.
Sorry, Kelvin. Sorry. I was just going to say, because I do primarily crime. When it comes to sort of what we are looking for as criminal advocates, I can't really speak for, the civil lot or the family lot. But when you're looking at criminal advocates, we're looking for ability to articulate, presentation, so the way that you structure your argument. It doesn't necessarily hang on whether you know the ins and outs of the law. It's more about how you pull out the key facts and apply them to what you do know of the law and the way that you present it. So hopefully that sort of assists in terms of how you'd structure it. For example, if it was a plea mitigation, pick out all the key points, the key facts, apply it to what you say the key points are, and have some structure, some sense of structure, rather than wishy-washy mitigation. Likewise, the same applies if you're given a proposition. Again, structure your arguments, make sure that each point is an individual, concise one, rather than a bit of a free-flowing sort of essay type of answer.
And for the advocacy traditional barrister exercises, if it was like asking you to look at a proposition, my first year in undergraduate at Southampton, I learned the 3 Ps: principle, policy, practice. Yeah, what is the key principle you're trying to derive in your proposition or opposition to an argument? What is the policy areas it will infringe on, the legal, social, cultural, political, yeah, and what will happen in practice? So that gives you a framework in relation to, I should say, this is David Carson, who is, a wonderful lecturer in legal methods. So principle, policy, practice. It's what we debate. Some of you might not have done university debating and stuff like that. That's what I learned. It's a really strong structure, and it keeps people, because people like having repetition in relation to key arguments. It's like you say, from Brighton to Belfast, from Southampton to Skye. It's about telling that story. Yeah, so use that principle when you're looking at if you're looking at the general question, what's your what are the for or against Palestinian refugees, or for or against criminal defense lawyers. So principle, policy, practice, and that really does enable you to have that framework for that. Does anybody else from 33 want to pitch in relation to the advocacy point? Okay, Chloe, your question.
Yes, I am curious about the actual marking and moderation process that takes place after interviews. I think it's something candidates don't really get an insight into. And I was wondering if you might be able to give us examples, if not of your chamber's marking process and the criteria you use, of a generic one, if such a thing exists.
Well, Liz and Aisha are on the pupillage committee. So Liz, what would your response be?
So I'm not sure that our marking criteria is set out online, so I'm not sure whether we can go into that. But I know that some sets do set out quite well their marking criteria. So a really good example is Matrix Chambers. They have their marking criteria for their written applications, and then also what they're marking against for interviews. But on the whole, Chambers are always looking for a similar thing. So they always want to see your academic background. They want to see your advocacy skills, both written and oral advocacy, depending on the area of law that you're applying to. They may want to see the qualities that you would require to be a barrister. And then I think we will undertake training when it comes to marking applications and for interviews, and that's to ensure for equality and diversity, and to also so that we're all aware of any internal and unconscious biases that we may have. But it's quite a subjective process, and so it's based on really seeing somebody and how you think that they appear, how they present themselves. And then sometimes it comes down to comparing candidates to each other, because as I said earlier, or we discussed earlier, often everybody has very similar credentials. So it's very difficult to tell people apart. Don't know if Aisha, you've got anything else that you'd like to add for that? It's quite a difficult question. I don't really feel like I've got much more of an insight having been on a committee than before when I was applying.
we try and be sort of as objective as possible, at least at the very outset when we're going through the paper sift. So we sort of have education as one sort of topic, marks out of 5, oral advocacy and that experience that you've got, written advocacy, the experience that you've got in terms of drafting, commitment to the bar is another section that we tend to use to sort of give marks, and temperament, which is more not just about, you know, your personality, but the way you, for example, handle stress, deal with criticism, things like that. Those are kind of the sort of 5 core areas that we use for the paper sift. And then when we move on to interviews, we then sort of modulate things a little bit further, because you've made it through the paper sift, therefore it's a fresh canvas for everybody. We're looking more at, for example, whether you can think on your feet, whether you are a persuasive advocate, whether you can deal with the stress of the bar and criticism and things like that. So then we have a slightly different marking scheme for that process. And then, of course, at least at our chambers, we've introduced a short advocacy exercise in our first round, so we can actually get a proper idea of somebody thinking very quickly on their feet and how well they perform in terms of actual advocacy. Hopefully that sort of gives you a bit more insight as to, well, how we do things at 33. But the principle applies across the board to other chambers. They all have similar systems in place with similar sort of categories.
Yeah, and you'll find that you know, just as the human condition is that when you're on the other side as a panelist, you know, I've been interviewing for 20 years in different sort of capacities, is that you'll see the people who shine. Yeah. And the people who shine are the people who are authentic. I mean, in my field, it's about the lived experience that you get to know and you connect with that person, because that's what you do as a barrister. You have to connect with your judge, you connect with your client, because that's what we're here to do, to persuade. And it's not about being artificial or trying to fit into a stereotype. It's not the way you speak, it's the way you think. It's the way you listen. It's the way you engage with what drives you, what's your passion in my area. Yeah, it may be slightly different in other areas. I totally get that. But in a lot of the areas, especially in common law chambers, it's about what makes you you. And especially in today's day, as somebody who comes from, we're here on the Association of British Tamil Lawyers to say that we're here to make sure that those who are underrepresented at the bar feel that they've got as many, weapons to their armory to be able to succeed. Is that, there's nothing wrong in being able to tell part of your story about what has got you here. My favorite phrase is, life is not a journey, life is not a destination, it's a journey. you know, and this is part of your journey. So that's very important. Sophie, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, so just in relation to what you said actually about connecting with people, my question is, when you're faced with a perhaps larger panel, so yesterday, for example, I had an interview and there were 7 people all on the table. I found it harder to make that connection, perhaps in comparison to a situation in which you would have, I don't know, 3 or 4 people on the panel. And obviously I was looking at the person that asked me the question and then giving them the response and then doing a bit of toing and froing with them. But then it felt like it was difficult or more difficult to connect with more people. How would you advise to go?
Very easy. So you have the person who gives the question. You connect with them at the beginning, but remember you have the 6 others around the table who are also marking you. So what I do in my experience is you answer firstly at the question, but remember you're a storyteller. So then you move to somebody else in the room and then you connect round. So they're actually traveling with you as you're telling the story. I find it works. Yeah, because then you're bringing the whole room to you as the storyteller. Yeah, I remember my first time, my first experience of advocacy is 5 years old, standing on a chair talking about Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. And that's why I knew I wanted to be an advocate, because I loved seeing all my friends watch me tell the story as I looked around their faces across, 5 years Cookfield Primary School. Yeah. So, that's what really drew me to be an advocate. So do that, be that storyteller, be that, that person who's telling that story, which gets everybody from the outskirts of the room inside into the room to listen to you. That's my takeaway on that. Anybody else from the panel want to feed into that?
Yeah, just my biggest thing is, especially when you're dealing with multiple people, is the first thing I like to try and establish is eye contact, and shift your eye contact. Not, your eyes aren't darting from person to person, but as you're making points, you're making considered points to pause and connect with each person on that panel, especially if they're all sitting in front of you, it makes it slightly easier because they're all hopefully within your field of view and you're not having to turn around. But that's the first thing. If there are multiple people, that's the first thing I would try and do, is I'd try and establish eye contact with each of them individually. What you would then might want to do is, as you're telling that story, as you're engaging with each one, especially if different panelists have engaged with you on various different questions, bring them back into the fold, in the sense of not just you having that eye contact, but going, oh, and actually that relates to the question that you asked earlier. And you can then physically almost bring them back into that conversation by going, yes, what I'm currently talking about, although it's a different question, relates to something you've asked me. And most people, it's a natural habit, especially here in the UK, where everyone's ever so polite. The minute you make reference to them, they're going to look at you. They're not going to do such a thing of going, oh no, they mentioned me. No, they're going to engage with you on that point. So if you feel that you want to very politely but gently try and really coax that, you can use what they're giving you in terms of their engagement and their questions to your advantage, to bring them all in and to have them all listen. But those are 2 of the key things that I like to employ, especially when I'm in front of multiple people. So for example, I was in the upper tribunal in front of a panel, and they're sat very up high and you're very sort of down at your desk. And so you did need to very much, while you're standing and presenting your submissions, engage with each one, looking up, making sure they're all paying attention, because sometimes they'll be making their own notes and you don't want them to miss what you're saying.
Yep, but also don't cross a line. Where I suddenly feel very uncomfortable is when somebody says, well, as you said in this case. Yeah, that's a bit sycophantic. Don't do that. It doesn't make people feel comfortable. So, there is a line, I mean, do your research on your panel. You'll be told who's on your panel. Quickly go onto Google and check who these people are. But don't be sycophantic and say, cross the line in relation to that, because that's uncomfortable. Anybody else from the panel want to add any additions to that? We've got some more time. I mean, can I just invite, oh, Cynthia, did you want to ask a question? Sorry.
Yes, I did. Can you hear me okay? So the question I wanted to ask is sort of leading on from that question about engaging a panel. I was wondering, like, you're obviously online interviews are becoming more common nowadays, and even like online hearings as well. How do you deal with adapting that sort of advocacy skill set to an online environment, and like sort of engaging and keeping eye contact is a bit more difficult in that scenario. So I just wanted to ask how you guys would deal with it.
Aisha, Liz, from the Chambers perspective. I mean, we don't do online. Do we do online, or is it all in? Okay, Aisha.
Our first rounds have in fact been online, which has been quite a difficult adaptation, having I think previously done them all in person. It's difficult. It is all I can say in terms of adapting. And you've got to remember that when we don't have you in person, we don't get as full a sort of vibe off you as to how you really are. We also find it sometimes harder to read people when we only have their face and we can't really tell what they're doing. For example, are their eyes twitching off to one side because they've got notes there, or are they just actually thinking something that we would know in person, but we can't always tell. So think about the way that you are presenting, because it's just like being on TV. Unfortunately, we are focused on what your face is doing. In any movements we will notice that we might not ordinarily notice. So it's just being aware of that, I think, and just obviously confining things to that short box of your computer screen, and just being aware that we can see what's going on. And that's what our focus is on.
Yeah, I think that's why Liz has got the best background out of all of us. I mean, don't have a background like mine if you're interviewing on Zoom. You can just focus on Liz as a person with no distractions. Poor Aisha and I have our dogs to deal with, and Aisha's got a cat. So just make sure you're sorry, Liz.
I was just looking for my dog to see where she's gone, but she's coming running. Here we go. Ellie, come say hi.
Oh, fabulous. Oh, that was mean to bring my dog. Oh, it's gorgeous.
You can say hi.
Absolutely. Well, look, that's a wonderful way to wrap up. Thank you all who've linked in today to for this association of Bishop Tamil Lawyers in 33 Bedford Row in relation to this mock interviews. It's the first time ABTL have run anything like this. I'd like to really thank Anna Michu for all their assistance. Can we see you on screen to say goodbye? Great, there we are. Thank you so much for all your technical help today. ABTL will ABTL will be putting this online later on through the LinkedIn and Twitter channels as well. And best of luck for all of you in relation to your interviews. Do please keep in touch. We'd love to know how you get on with your interviews. And on 6th of May, we'll be crossing our fingers and toes and everything for you. So thank you very much, and keep in touch, and best of luck. If I can just ask those three, Bedford Row and the ABTL, to stay online. For the rest of you, thank you very much and good night. Good luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was really helpful. Thank you.
Bye. There we are.